The air in St. Jude's Church was thick with the scent of old wood, beeswax, and the nervous anticipation of 100 young souls. Outside, the Ohio spring of 1892 was still cold, the ground muddy and reluctant to thaw, a perfect reflection of the mood inside the small parish. 11-year-old Elias Croft, however, felt none of the usual Sunday solemnity. His heart was a drumbeat of rebellion against the starched white suit his mother had forced him into, against the suffocating silence, and most of all, against the priest's droning sermon on redemption and sin. Father Thomas, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weariness of 1,000 confessions, stood at the altar. His voice was a low, steady current, but Elias heard only the ticking of the grandfather clock in the back of the church. This was it. First, communion, a rite of passage that everyone else seemed to revere, but to Elias it felt like an elaborate trap, a promise of eternal salvation in exchange for an eternal lie. He had never believed in the stories, the miracles, the divine grace. To him, they were just stories his parents told themselves to make the hardship of their lives feel meaningful. Elias's best friend, Finn, sat beside him, his face a portrait of solemn reverence. Finn's family was as devout as they came. His father a man who believed every word of the Bible as if it were a direct message from God himself. Finn had even tried to convince Elias of the truth of it all just yesterday, his voice full of a gentle conviction that Elias couldn't understand. "Just try to believe, Elias," Finn had whispered, their boots squelching in the mud of the farm lane. "You'll feel it. The peace." Elias had just shrugged, kicking a stone into a puddle. "Or I'll just feel wet." Now, as the choir began to sing a hymn, its notes echoing through the cavernous space, Elias felt his stomach clench. The moment was approaching. One by one, the other children began to walk to the altar, their small hands clasped, their eyes downcast. They looked like ghosts in their white garments, floating towards a destiny Elias refused to accept. When it was his turn, his legs felt heavy, as if he were walking through water. He watched as the children before him knelt, their faces upturned to receive the host, a small dry wafer, a symbol of a promise he found empty. He knelt beside Finn, the worn velvet of the kneeler rough against his knees. Father Thomas approached, his eyes moving over each child with a practiced benevolence. When his gaze landed on Elias, something flickered. A brief moment of doubt, a subtle narrowing of the eyes that Elias caught. The priest had always seen something in him, something untamed and questioning. "The body of Christ," Father Thomas whispered, placing the wafer on the tongue of the child next to Elias. Then, it was his turn. Elias opened his mouth, but as the priest reached out with the host, an impulse sharp and sudden as a needle pierced through him. It wasn't a choice so much as an instinct, an act of pure, unadulterated defiance against the ritual, against the lies, against the world that demanded he conform. As Father Thomas brought the chalice to his lips, Elias felt a strange heat in his throat. He looked at the priest's weary, expectant face, and in that instant he saw not a holy man but a tired actor in a long, predictable play. Elias tilted his head back, and a small, deliberate amount of spittle landed in the silver cup. The clear, consecrated wine rippled. The sound of a dropped hymnal echoed through the stunned silence. Father Thomas's eyes went wide, not with anger but with a profound, bone-deep horror. He froze, the chalice still in his hand, his gaze locked on the small, almost imperceptible disturbance on the surface of the wine. Elias, for his part, felt a rush of something akin to victory. It was a foolish, childish act, he knew, but in that moment, it felt monumental. He had spat in the face of what they called holy. The moment was shattered by a gasping sob from the back of the church. Elias's mother, her hand over her mouth, her face pale as a shroud. His father stood up, a deep, furious blush creeping up his neck. The other children looked at Elias with a mixture of fear and revulsion. Finn, his face a mask of betrayal, scooted away from him on the kneeler. The rest of the ceremony was a blur. Elias was yanked from the church by his furious father. The shame of the act, a physical weight on his shoulders. The world outside felt different now. The air was colder, the mud slicker. He had done something, and in doing so, he had changed everything. That evening, the first drops of rain began to fall. Not a gentle spring shower, but a relentless, cold torrent that beat against the windows of their small farmhouse. The sound was a constant, drumming noise, a soundtrack to his parents' silent, stony disappointment. They didn't even speak to him. The silence was worse than any punishment. The next morning, the rain had not stopped. It poured down, a solid curtain of grey. His father went out to tend to the livestock, his shoulders hunched against the storm. When he returned, his face was pale, his eyes wide with a terror Elias had never seen before. "The creek," his father whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's overflowing. The bridge is gone." The news spread quickly. The small creek that ran through their village, usually no more than a trickle in the spring, had become a raging river, its muddy waters swallowing everything in its path. The bridge, the only way in and out of their part of town, was gone. They were cut off. As the day wore on, the news grew grimmer. Reports came from neighbors, shouted across the floodwaters, of the entire village of St. Jude's being drenched in a relentless, blood-red rain. It wasn't the color of rust or mud, but a deep, viscous crimson. And it wasn't just falling on the church, it was everywhere. On the roofs, on the fields, on the faces of the terrified townsfolk who stood on the edge of the newly formed lake, watching their world turn a shade of impossible red. The whispers began immediately. The boy. He defiled the chalice. It's a sign. Elias stood at his window, watching the endless crimson downpour. The world he had defied was now drenched in a terrifying, grotesque echo of his sin. He felt no victory now, only a cold, creeping dread. It was a coincidence, it had to be. But the fear in the eyes of his father, the whispers that carried on the wind, they told a different story. And as the red rain continued to fall, Elias realized with a gut-wrenching certainty that this was only the beginning. His small act of rebellion had not just defied God. It had somehow unleashed a terror upon his home, and he was the only one who knew the truth of what he had done. The horror wasn't supernatural, not really. It was far more chilling than that. It was the terrifying, undeniable link between a boy's defiance and the sudden, impossible blood that now stained the world. The red rain continued its relentless fall, painting the world outside the Croft farmhouse in shades of crimson and fear. Elias, still confined to the house by the floodwaters and his father's furious silence, found himself drawn to the window as if to a dreadful spectacle. He wasn't watching the rain, he was watching the creek. It was no longer the muddy brown stream he knew, but a roiling, angry torrent of deep red. It looked less like water and more like a river of blood, a horrifying visual manifestation of his guilt. His mother, Sarah, moved through the small kitchen like a phantom, her face drawn and pale. She would not meet his eyes. A silent accusation more damning than any shouted words. The only communication she offered was a series of quick, desperate glances towards the window, then back at him, as if confirming the impossible link between his act and the world's sudden monstrous change. His father, Thomas, was a man of the earth, his hands calloused from years of farming. He was a practical man, a man of facts and labor. This phenomenon, this crimson deluge, was a fact, but it defied all reason. Elias watched him pace the length of the living room, his boots tracking mud onto the worn rug, his face a storm of confusion and mounting panic. "It's not blood. His father muttered to himself, his voice a low, strangled rasp. It can't be. It's red dirt, something with the iron in the soil. Elias knew better. He had seen the terror in Father Thomas's eyes the day before, a fear that was not born of logic. It was a primal fear, the kind reserved for things that should not exist. And this red rain, this flood, it was one of them. Late in the afternoon, a banging came from the front door, not a knock, but a frantic, desperate pounding. His father grabbed a lamp and hurried to open it. Standing on the porch, his clothes soaked and his face streaked with crimson mud, was a neighbor, Silas Finch. He was a man known for his calm, quiet demeanor, but now his eyes were wide with a frantic wildness. "Thomas, you must come. It's the livestock. My cows, they won't drink the water." His father's face hardened. "It's the color, Silas. It's the minerals in the water. They'll get over it." No, you don't understand. They're dying of thirst. They won't even touch it. And the crops, the wheat is turning black, shriveled up as if it were scorched." Silas's voice was a panicked wail. Elias's father stepped out onto the porch, his eyes scanning the flooded landscape. The red water had risen, now lapping at the edge of their front yard. The wheat fields, usually a vibrant green this time of year, were indeed a sickly, decaying black. "It's the boy, isn't it?" Silas whispered, his voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. His eyes, full of both fear and loathing, found Elias's face through the window. "He brought this upon us, his sin." Elias recoiled from the window. The words hit him like a physical blow. He was the cause, not just of the rain, but of the town's suffering, the animals, the crops, the very land itself. A cold certainty settled in his stomach, a sense of doom so heavy it was almost a comfort. There was no escape. Over the next few days, the situation in the isolated community grew desperate. The red floodwaters cut them off completely. Food supplies began to dwindle, and the fear in people's eyes was no longer about the color of the water, but about the very real possibility of starvation. Neighbors, usually so close-knit, began to eye each other with suspicion. The whispers about Elias grew louder, morphing from rumor into a grim, shared conviction. One morning, the shouting began. From a small hill overlooking the town, Elias saw a crowd of men gathering. He recognized their faces. Silas Finch, the miller, the blacksmith, and even Finn's father, a man Elias had always respected. They were all soaked with the red rain, their faces haggard, their eyes burning with a righteous fury. His own father, Thomas, stood on their porch, a rifle cradled in his arms. He wasn't aiming it at the crowd, but the message was clear. The father had chosen his son over his neighbors, and that choice was a betrayal in their eyes. "Thomas Croft, give us the boy," Silas yelled, his voice raw with a mixture of anger and panic. "He brought this, the Lord's judgment." "There's no judgment here, Silas, just a strange rain." Thomas Croft's voice was strained, but his resolve was firm. Elias watched, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt no courage, only a profound, sickening fear. He saw Finn standing at the edge of the crowd, his face pale and conflicted. Finn's father was pulling him back, whispering fiercely in his ear. Finn looked at Elias, and in that moment, Elias saw the friendship that had once existed between them shatter completely. It was replaced by the same horrified accusation that was in everyone else's eyes. The confrontation ended with a tense standoff, the men retreating into the gloom of the storm, their anger simmering beneath the surface. His father came back inside, his face pale, his hands trembling. He put the rifle down on the kitchen table and looked at Elias with a deep, crushing sorrow. "They believe it," his father said, his voice barely a whisper. "They truly believe you did this." Elias couldn't speak. He was trapped. The storm outside was a physical barrier, but the real prison was the one of his own making, the one built from the spittle in a sacred chalice and the whispers of a community consumed by fear. The logical, reasonable part of him screamed that it was a coincidence, a strange environmental anomaly, but the rest of him, the parts that were now raw and exposed, knew better. The world had gone mad, and he had been the one to tip the first domino. The truth of the matter was a chilling, psychological terror. There were no ghosts or demons, only the raw, undeniable consequence of an act of defiance and the terrifying belief that it had called forth a biblical wrath. The storm wasn't just rain, it was a punishment, and it was Elias's alone to bear. The red rain, which had fallen for 3 days and 3 nights, finally gave way to a cold, suffocating drizzle. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and something else, something metallic and sickly sweet. It was the scent of the red water as it soaked into everything, a lingering testament to the unnatural storm. With the worst of the rain over, the floodwaters began to recede, but the relief was short-lived. A new, more insidious terror began to spread through the community. The first to fall ill was old Mrs. Gable, a kind woman who lived alone at the edge of the woods. She was found in her bed, feverish and rambling, her skin mottled with a dark purplish rash. The local doctor, a stern man named Dr. Alistair, could make no sense of it. Soon, others followed. A farmer named John Barnes, his face a sickly yellow. The miller's wife, who could no longer speak, only cough up a thick, dark phlegm. Children with a strange, weeping ailment in their eyes. The sickness seemed to be spreading, its symptoms varied and baffling. Panic, which had been simmering beneath the surface, now boiled over. Elias, still a pariah in his own home, watched the townspeople's fear morph into something far more dangerous, a hunt for a scapegoat. The doctor's initial diagnosis of a new fever was quickly rejected by the populace. They had their own explanation, and it pointed directly at him. The spittle, the chalice, the defiled sacrament. To their minds, the blood rain had been a warning. The sickness was the punishment. His mother, Sarah, who had been distant and cold, now clung to a desperate hope. She began to care for him with a frantic, over-the-top tenderness, preparing his meals separately, insisting he wear gloves, even as he protested. Her fear was palpable. She wasn't just afraid of the community's wrath, she was afraid of him or of what he represented. She feared he had been cursed, and she was desperate to protect him from himself, as if his very touch could carry the blight. One evening, while his father was out with a group of men trying to clear the mud from the roads, a young boy from the village, no older than 10, staggered to their front door. His name was Peter, and he was the son of the miller. His face was covered in the weeping sores that were the latest symptom of the sickness. He stood there, shivering, his eyes fixed on Elias. He's a devil, Peter rasped, his voice raw with fever. He gave us this sickness. Elias's mother rushed to the boy, but Peter recoiled from her, falling back into the mud. He pointed a trembling, scabbed finger at Elias, his eyes full of a childlike terror that was more chilling than any adult's fury. The whispers had become shouts, and now the shouts were backed by the agonizing reality of sickness and death. The first death came the next day. Mrs. Gable, her body twisted and ravaged by the mysterious fever. Her funeral was a somber, silent affair, and all eyes were on Elias. They no longer saw a boy, they saw a source of contagion, a living curse. Finn, who had avoided Elias since the day of the communion, appeared at their window in the dead of night. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. He didn't knock. He just stood there in the pouring rain staring at Elias. I heard they're going to get you," Finn whispered through the pane of glass, his voice almost lost in the sound of the rain. "My father, He says you have to be purified for the good of the village. The word purified hung in the air like a shroud. Elias knew what it meant. It was a word a desperate community would use to justify an atrocity. They weren't talking about prayer anymore. The fear that had been building inside Elias finally broke. He wasn't just a boy who had made a mistake. He was an enemy of the people, the cause of a plague, and a target for their desperate, righteous rage. The psychological torment was a far worse sickness than the fever that now gripped the town. He was trapped in a nightmare he had created, a nightmare that was now turning real and violent. The real terror was not in the red rain or the fever, but in the dark heart of humanity, in its capacity to turn on its own when faced with the unknown. Elias was a boy who had spat in a chalice, and in doing so, he had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with their world. The town's sickness was a grim reality, but the community's shared delusion was the true contagion. The death of Mrs. Gable was a turning point. It wasn't just a loss, it was a spark that ignited the community's smoldering anger into an open flame. Fear gave way to a grim determination. The town, once a collection of tight-knit neighbors, had splintered into a furious mob, unified by a single terrifying conviction: Elias Croft was the source of their suffering. The first physical act of hostility came in the form of a rock. It shattered the living room window, a jagged hole in the pane letting in the cold, damp air. Tied to the rock was a small, crudely drawn effigy of a boy, his face painted with a single drop of red. His father, Thomas, stood in the wreckage, his face a mask of weary resolve. He no longer talked about minerals or strange weather. The truth for him was now a matter of brute force and defense. "We'll board it up," his father said, his voice flat. He looked at Elias, his eyes devoid of the usual paternal warmth. "Don't go near the windows." Elias retreated to his small bedroom, the sound of his father hammering boards over the window a funeral drumbeat. He was a prisoner in his own home, a pariah to his own family. His mother's love had soured into a desperate, frantic fear, and his father's protection was a cold, pragmatic duty. There was no warmth, no solace, only the chilling reality of his isolation. The nights were the worst. He would lie awake, listening to the whispered conversations of his parents in the next room. His mother's voice was a high, panicked hum. His father's was a low, rumbling refusal. "He is our son, Sarah. We will not give him up," his father would say. "But what if they're right? What if he is cursed?" she would plead. Elias would clench his fists, the words a knife to his gut. He was alone, truly alone. The next morning the shouting started again. The crowd was larger this time, armed with farming tools and lanterns, their faces twisted with a religious fervor. Finn's father was at the front, his face a grim mask. He wasn't just a man of faith, he was a man of action, and he was convinced of his righteousness. "Thomas Croft, the town has spoken. Give us the boy so we can be cleansed," he bellowed. Thomas Croft stood on the porch, his rifle still in his hands. "You will not step foot on my property. This is a sickness, not a curse. The doctor said so himself." "The doctor is a fool. Look at the red water. Look at our dying children." A woman's voice screamed from the crowd. The situation was spiraling out of control. The logical explanations, a waterborne disease, a strange chemical runoff, a virus, were no match for the simple, terrifying narrative of sin and divine punishment. The human mind, when faced with an incomprehensible threat, will seek the simplest and most satisfying answer, even if it is the most brutal. As the standoff intensified, Elias saw Finn standing at the back of the crowd, his face ashen. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, the horror on Finn's face was replaced by a flicker of doubt, a shadow of the old friendship. Elias saw it. Finn was conflicted. He believed his father, but a part of him also remembered the boy who had once been his best friend. Then a voice in the crowd shouted, "Let's just burn the house down. It'll cleanse the land." The words sent a shockwave through the mob. The idea was so simple, so horrifyingly final. Thomas Croft raised his rifle, and the mob, caught between their fury and the threat of a bullet, fell back, but not for long. Elias retreated to his room, his heart a frantic bird in a cage. He looked out his window at the red-soaked world, at the angry faces of the people he had grown up with. He was an outcast. He was a monster in their eyes. He had spat in a chalice, and now he was paying a price far beyond anything he could have ever imagined. The real terror of this story wasn't the supernatural, it was the chilling human capacity for cruelty and mob mentality. It was the knowledge that a small act of defiance could unleash a fury so great it could destroy a community and condemn a boy to a living hell. His defiance had not only alienated him from God, but from humanity itself. He was alone, and the world was now a reflection of his own personal, self-inflicted nightmare. The standoff at the Croft farmhouse ended with the mob retreating into the red-soaked gloom of the village. The night passed in a tense, silent vigil. Elias lay awake in his bed, listening to the heavy silence of his family, the deep, ragged breaths of his father, and the soft, panicked whimpers of his mother. The next morning, the sun rose on a world that was still red, but a new terror had taken hold. It was no longer about the sickness, but about the secrets. The first one was discovered by a neighbor, old Mr. Hemlock, who had ventured to the edge of the woods. He found the body of a young boy, one of the first children to fall ill. The boy had not died of the fever. His death was a result of a broken neck. The body lay at the bottom of a ravine, but the evidence pointed to something far more sinister. There were clear footprints in the red mud, footprints that were not the boy's. A different kind of whisper began to circulate through the town, a low, urgent hum. The sickness was not a punishment from God. It was a curse, and the people were dying not just from fever, but from something far worse. They were being targeted. This new development, instead of calming the mob, only made them more desperate. The hunt for the source of the curse intensified. The focus shifted from punishment to possession. The villagers, now terrified by the possibility of a malevolent force at work, were convinced that the boy who had defiled the holy chalice was not just the cause of their misfortune, but a vessel for it. Elias's father, a man of simple faith and a deep-seated belief in justice, began to realize the grim truth. The whispers about purification had a chilling new meaning. He saw the shift in the town's gaze, the way they looked at his son. It was not just anger now, but a cold, calculating fear. One day, as the two of them were alone, his father's guard finally broke. He sat down at the kitchen table, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on the boarded-up window. "Elias," he began, his voice barely audible. "What happened at the church? Why did you do it?" Elias was stunned. It was the first time his father had directly addressed the act. He saw the pain and confusion in his father's eyes, a man trying to reconcile the son he knew with the monster the town was now seeing. "I don't know," Elias whispered. I couldn't lie anymore. I don't believe." His father sighed, a deep, shuddering breath. "And now this." He pointed vaguely toward the window, toward the red-soaked world. What if there is a reason for this? A human reason? The question hung in the air, a fragile lifeline in a sea of madness. His father was searching for a logical explanation, a human cause for the unexplainable, a way to save his son from a fate the town had already decided upon. Later that day, Elias's mother, who had been avoiding him for days, came to him with a grim, determined look on her face. She held a tattered, leather-bound journal in her hand. "Your grandfather's," she said, her voice a low, conspiratorial tone. "He was an apothecary. He kept this." Elias took the journal. The pages were filled with strange symbols and meticulous notes, a blend of medicinal recipes and cryptic observations. He flipped through it, his eyes catching a page with a detailed drawing of a strange, fungus-like growth, a purplish-black substance that looked eerily similar to the rash on the townspeople's skin. The notes beside it were in his grandfather's spidery handwriting. "Found in the mines near town. A strange, black fungus. Toxic if ingested, leads to fever, delirium, and a spreading purplish rash. Must be kept away from water sources. The water, it makes it grow." A cold wave of clarity washed over Elias. The mines. He knew about them. Abandoned, forgotten. But what if they weren't? What if they were the source of the red water, the source of the sickness? The red color could be a result of the minerals in the water reacting with the toxic fungus. The sickness, the fever, the rash, it all made sense. He thought the owners were trying to cover it up. His mother whispered, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear, a fear of a human conspiracy, not a divine curse. They knew the mines were toxic, and the water, it would carry it everywhere. The horrifying truth began to dawn on Elias, his spittle in the chalice, the red rain, the sickness, the deaths. They weren't divine punishment, they were a terrifying, grotesque coincidence. An act of his defiance had coincided with a man-made horror that was now unfolding before his eyes. He had become the symbolic cause of a real, human tragedy. The psychological terror had now shifted from a religious delusion to a chilling and far more dangerous human conspiracy. The town was not just afflicted by a sickness, but was being systematically poisoned, and he was the one who had, by sheer coincidence, become a scapegoat for it all. The secret hidden within his grandfather's journal was a fragile, dangerous lifeline. Elias clutched the tattered pages, the words of a long-dead apothecary offering a terrifying and logical explanation for the nightmare that had consumed the town. The red rain was not blood. It was water contaminated with minerals from the mines. The sickness was not a curse. It was a poisoning caused by a toxic fungus that thrived in the contaminated water. The death of the young boy wasn't an act of a supernatural entity, it was a consequence of a fever-induced delirium, a fall into a ravine. The horror was not of the divine, but of the human. A mining company's greed, their callous disregard for the community's well-being, had created this disaster. Elias, in his act of rebellion, had simply given the town a convenient and comforting story to explain the unexplainable. A story of sin and salvation, far more palatable than the cold, hard truth of corporate negligence and human cruelty. The immediate problem, however, was how to make the town believe it. His father, a man of simple faith, was already on the verge of accepting the terrifying logic of the journal. But the rest of the community, now a furious mob, was a different matter. They were not looking for an explanation. They were looking for a scapegoat. "We have to show them," Elias's father said, his voice laced with a new determination. "We have to show them what's in the mines." The plan was simple and incredibly dangerous. They would have to find a way to get to the mines, a journey that would take them through the town's now hostile streets, and collect a sample of the black fungus, a sample of the contaminated water. Proof. The next day, as a low grey sun filtered through the clouds, Elias's father began to pack a small satchel. He was a man transformed, his fear replaced by a righteous fury. He was no longer just a father protecting his son. He was a man seeking justice. "I have to go to the mines," he said, his voice firm. "I'll take the journal with me. I'll show the men, the ones I can trust." But Elias knew it was a suicide mission. The town's fury had been focused on him. If his father were to walk into the village with a strange journal and a wild story about toxic minds, he would be met with scorn, not understanding. "No, Papa," Elias said, his voice trembling but firm. "I have to go. They'll listen to me. I'm the one they're angry at." His father stared at him, his face a mixture of fear and pride. He saw the courage that had been born out of his son's fear. He saw the boy, who had once spat in a chalice out of defiance, now stepping forward to face a mob out of a desperate need for redemption. Later that afternoon, as the town's fury grew to a fever pitch, Elias decided to act. He grabbed the journal and slipped out the back door, leaving his parents with a quiet nod. He knew they couldn't stop him. He knew they understood. He was walking into the mouth of the lion. But he had to. He walked through the red mud, the air still heavy with the sickly scent of contamination. He saw the hushed groups of villagers, their faces grim, their eyes full of suspicion. He saw the empty streets, the closed shops, the terrifying silence of a town in mourning and fear. He made his way to the church, the place where it had all begun. The doors were locked, but a large crowd was gathered in the square, their faces turned toward the boarded-up church. He saw Finn's father at the center of the crowd, his hands raised in a prayer, his eyes full of a righteous fire. Elias walked to the center of the square, his small frame dwarfed by the angry mob. He held the journal up, its leather cover a stark contrast to his pale, trembling hands. "I did it," he said, his voice small at first, but then growing stronger, filled with a raw, desperate courage. "I spat in the chalice, and I am the cause of this." A shocked silence fell over the crowd. The whispers stopped, the prayers ceased. All eyes were on him. "But not for the reasons you think," Elias continued, his voice a desperate plea. "Not because of a curse, not because I am evil." And then he began to tell them the story, not of a divine punishment, but of a human one. He told them about his grandfather's journal, about the toxic mines, about the poisoned water. He held up the journal as proof. He spoke of the sickness, of the symptoms that matched the notes in the book. He spoke of the coincidence of his act and the strange rain, a coincidence that had created a perfect storm of fear and blame. The crowd listened, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Some scoffed, some looked away, but others, the ones who had lost a loved one, the ones who were now sick themselves, they listened with a quiet, desperate hope. At that moment, the true terror was revealed. It wasn't the red rain or the sickness. It was the horrifying, sickening truth that they had been so willing to believe in a divine curse rather than face the brutal reality of their own kind's greed. Elias had not just confessed to his act, he had confessed to their collective delusion. He had offered them a truth far more chilling than any curse. The story was now about their own moral blindness, and in that moment, Elias realized he had a chance to save them, but only if they were willing to listen. Elias's confession hung in the air, a fragile thread of reason in a storm of fear and religious fervor. The townspeople were torn. Some scoffed, their faith in a divine curse too deeply ingrained to be shaken by a boy's story. Others, however, the ones who were already questioning, the ones whose children were sick, listened with a desperate, painful hope. Finn's father, a man of profound faith, stepped forward, his face etched with conflict. "The boy speaks blasphemy. This is a test of our faith. Do not believe his lies." But Finn, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd, pushed past his father. He walked towards Elias, his face pale and tear-stained. "Papa, Elias is not a liar." He turned to the crowd, his voice raw with emotion. "He is my friend. I believe him. I saw his grandfather's journal. It's real." Finn's simple, heartfelt plea was more powerful than any argument. The townspeople knew Finn. He was a good, honest boy, the son of the most devout man in town. His testimony carried weight. A tense silence fell over the square. The mob had been deflated. The unity of their anger was gone, replaced by doubt and confusion. Elias, seizing the moment, spoke again. "I can prove it. The mines are to the north. I will go there. I will bring back proof. A sample of the fungus, a sample of the water." The offer was a challenge, a promise of tangible evidence. A handful of men, including Finn's father, a man now visibly shaken by his son's defiance and his own growing doubts, agreed to accompany them. It was a pilgrimage of sorts, a desperate quest for the truth that would either vindicate Elias or condemn him forever. The journey was arduous. The roads were still choked with red mud. The air was heavy with a sickly mist. The group, which included Elias, his father Finn, Finn's father, and a few other men, moved in a tense, silent procession. They were no longer a mob. They were a group of men bound by a common, desperate need for answers. As they walked, Elias saw the true extent of the devastation. The fields, once a lush green, were now a grotesque black. The livestock, their coats matted with red mud, huddled together, their eyes glazed with fever. The stench of decay hung in the air, a silent testament to the suffering that had been inflicted upon their land. They reached the abandoned mines late in the afternoon. The entrance was a dark, gaping maw in the side of a hill, overgrown with thorny vines. Elias, his father, his face grim, led the way, a lantern in his hand casting long, dancing shadows. Inside, the air was cold and damp, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the silence. The walls were streaked with a deep, purplish-black substance, the fungus from his grandfather's journal. The water, which pooled in the crevices of the rock, was the same sickening red as the rain that had fallen on their town. "My God," Finn's father whispered, his voice a shaky prayer. He knelt down, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch the water. It was not blood, but a cold, metallic liquid. The evidence was irrefutable. Elias walked deeper into the mine, his lantern casting a flickering light on the walls. He saw the black fungus everywhere, a parasitic growth that seemed to have consumed the very rock. He collected a sample in a small jar, the sight of it a terrifying confirmation of his grandfather's words. And then he saw it. A piece of paper, half buried in the mud, covered in the same purplish-black fungus. He picked it up, his hands trembling. It was a faded letterhead from a mining company, and beneath it, a crudely drawn map of the mine and a list of instructions. Leak in Section C. Do not attempt to fix. Use this area for runoff. The water will carry the residue away. Should not affect the community. The final, horrifying piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a deliberate, malicious act. The mining company had known about the leak, known about the toxic runoff, and had decided to simply let it flow into the creek that fed the town's water supply. They had gambled on the town's ignorance, on the fact that the water would dilute the poison enough to go unnoticed. But the heavy rain had overwhelmed the system, and the poison had flooded their land, their lives, their very souls. The terror wasn't in the divine, it was in the chilling human capacity for greed and indifference. Elias had been blamed for a curse, but the real curse was the one a corporation had inflicted upon them. A poison that had seeped not just into their water, but into the very fabric of their community, turning neighbor against neighbor and faith into fear. The truth was now in his hands, and it was a weapon far more powerful and far more dangerous than any mob's fury. The men emerged from the mine in stunned silence, the small jar containing the black fungus a horrifying testament to the truth. The proof was tangible, undeniable. They had come seeking answers, and they had found a human conspiracy far more chilling than any supernatural curse. Finn's father, his face pale and his eyes wide with shock, held the small piece of paper with the mining company's instructions. "My God," he whispered, his voice a ragged sob. "We were so wrong." The journey back to the village was no longer a tense march, but a grim, purposeful one. The men, their faith in a divine curse shattered by the cold, hard facts of the mine, now harbored a different kind of fury. They had been victims of a cruel, deliberate act of malice. Their anger, once focused on a terrified boy, now had a new and far more deserving target. The group arrived at the town square just as the sun was setting, casting long, menacing shadows. The townspeople were gathered, their faces still grim and suspicious. They saw the men, their hands holding the evidence, their faces transformed by a new, righteous rage. Elias's father stepped forward, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "We were all wrong. It wasn't a curse, it was a crime." He held up the piece of paper, his hand trembling. He explained what they had found, about the mining company's deliberate negligence, about the toxic fungus, about the poisoned water. The town listened, their faces a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and finally a slow, dawning comprehension. A man from the crowd, a shopkeeper who had lost his young daughter to the fever, stumbled forward, his face contorted in a mixture of grief and rage. Who is responsible? Elias's father pointed to the paper. A mining company. They knew. They let it happen. The truth, once revealed, spread like wildfire. The town's fury, once a disorganized, directionless mob, now had a single unified target. They were no longer angry at a boy. They were angry at a company that had poisoned their land and their lives. The whispers about Elias stopped, replaced by a low, furious murmur about the company and their executives. But the story wasn't over. Elias still had to face the man who had turned the town against him. Finn's father, a man whose faith had been built on a foundation of certainty, was now a man in pieces. He walked towards Elias, his hands shaking. I judged you, boy," he said, his voice raw with regret. "I was so blinded by my own faith, by my own fear. I'm so sorry." He embraced Elias, a broken, trembling gesture of forgiveness and reconciliation. The two boys, who had once been best friends, looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. They had both been victims of the same horrifying delusion, one born out of a human conspiracy. But the most difficult confrontation was yet to come. Elias knew he had to face his own actions. He had to face his parents, not just as a victim of a terrible circumstance, but as a boy who had made a conscious choice to defy their faith. He found his mother, Sarah, in the kitchen, her face a mask of weary relief. She looked at him, not with fear, but with a deep, profound sadness. "I was so afraid, Elias," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was so afraid you had done something unforgivable." "I did, Mama," Elias said, his voice raw with emotion. "I did something I shouldn't have. I spat in the chalice. It was a terrible thing to do." His mother looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. She didn't scold him. She didn't lecture him. She simply embraced him, a silent gesture of acceptance. The ordeal had stripped away the layers of pretense, the silent accusations, the fear that had separated them. They had faced a monstrous terror, one that had been created by their own kind. And in doing so, they had found a way back to each other. The psychological terror had now morphed into a grim, shared reality. The truth had not only exposed a human conspiracy, but had also forced them to confront their own flaws, their own capacity for fear and judgment. The story was no longer about a boy who had caused a curse, but about a community that had been saved by the truth. The truth, once it had taken root, grew with the ferocity of a wildfire. The town's focus shifted from divine retribution to human justice. The mob, which had once been a disorganized force of religious fervor, was now a unified and purposeful body, bound by a shared sense of betrayal and a burning need for a reckoning. Led by Elias's father and Finn's father, a delegation of men from the village set out for the nearest city, a 3-day journey by horse-drawn cart. They carried with them the journal, the piece of paper from the mining company, and the jar containing the black fungus. They were no longer just simple farmers. They were a determined force seeking justice for their poisoned community. Elias and Finn stayed behind, their friendship mended by the shared trauma and the fragile, dawning understanding that had brought them together. They spent their days helping the sick, bringing water from a fresh underground spring, and comforting the families who had lost loved ones. The work was grim, but it was a form of atonement, a way to heal the wounds that had been inflicted upon their community. The red water, though no longer a deluge, continued to recede, leaving behind a horrifying sludge of reddish-brown mud and a trail of ruined crops and dying animals. The sickness, though still present, was beginning to wane. The contaminated water supply, once the source of their suffering, was now being carefully avoided. The community was learning to survive, to rebuild, and to trust one another again. The wait for the men's return was an agonizing one. Elias and Finn would sit at the edge of town, their eyes fixed on the horizon, their hearts heavy with a mixture of hope and fear. They knew the battle was not over. The mining company, a powerful and influential corporation, would not go down without a fight. They would have lawyers and money and a powerful narrative of their own. But the truth had given the town a strength they had not had before. They had been united by a lie, and now they were united by a shared, terrifying reality. They were no longer victims of a curse. They were victims of a crime. 3 weeks later, the men returned. They were not alone. With them came a small contingent of federal agents, stern-faced men in crisp suits, who listened to the town's story with a quiet, professional interest. They looked at the journal, at the piece of paper, and at the red mud that still clung to the men's boots. They interviewed the sick, they documented the deaths, and they took samples of the water. The mining company's powerful narrative, their polished lies, began to unravel under the weight of the evidence. The federal agents found the same document in the company's offices, a document that had been carelessly misplaced, a record of their callous decision to let the toxic water run off into the community's water supply. The evidence was irrefutable. The case was no longer a matter of faith versus science, but of justice versus greed. The final reckoning was a grim but necessary process. The mining company's executives, who had knowingly poisoned an entire town for the sake of profit, were arrested and charged. The community of St. Jude's, though forever scarred by the tragedy, had found a way to heal. The red water was still a grim reminder of what they had endured, but it was no longer a symbol of divine punishment. It was a symbol of their resilience, a testament to their ability to overcome a horrifying human evil. Elias, who had once been an outcast, was now a quiet hero. He had not saved them from a curse, but he had given them the one thing they needed most: the truth. He had stood up against a wave of fear and delusion, and in doing so, had forced them to confront a reality that was far more chilling than any ghost or demon. The psychological terror had now given way to a quiet but profound sense of victory. The boy who had spat in the chalice had not been a bringer of curses, but a harbinger of truth. And the truth he had learned was the most powerful and terrifying force of all. The seasons turned, and the red water, now a constant presence in the town's memory, slowly began to lose its vibrant, menacing color. The mining company was brought to justice, their assets seized, their executives imprisoned. The town of St. Jude's, though forever changed, began the long, painful process of rebuilding. The town, once a collection of tight-knit neighbors, had been fractured by fear and suspicion. Now, they were a community forged in a shared tragedy. They had faced a monstrous terror, one created by their own kind, and in doing so, they had found a new, more profound sense of unity. Elias, no longer a pariah, was a quiet figure in the town. He was a boy who had been to hell and back, and it had left a mark on him. He was no longer the defiant, rebellious boy who had spat in a chalice. He was a young man with a quiet maturity, a man who understood the fragile, terrifying line between truth and delusion. His relationship with his parents had been forever altered. The silent accusations and the cold fear were gone, replaced by a deep, unspoken understanding. They had both faced their own demons, their own doubts, and in doing so, they had found a new, more honest way to love each other. One Sunday, a new priest arrived at St. Jude's Church. The old church, which had been abandoned and shunned after the incident, was now being cleaned and prepared for a new beginning. The new priest was a young man, his eyes clear and kind. He did not speak of curses or punishments. He spoke of forgiveness, of healing, and of the power of community. The first Mass in the newly restored church was a quiet, somber affair. The townspeople, their faces etched with the memories of what they had endured, sat in the pews, their hands clasped. They were not there for a sermon on fire and brimstone. They were there for a service of healing. As the new priest raised the chalice for the communion, a collective breath was held. The memory of the day was still raw, still a source of pain and shame. The chalice was no longer the same one. It was new, polished silver, a symbol of a new beginning. The priest's eyes fell on Elias. Elias, who was now a quiet figure in the back of the church, his face a picture of calm resolution. He had come, not out of a sense of obligation, but out of a need for closure. He had faced a monster, a man-made horror, and he had come out of it with the one thing he had always been searching for, the truth. As the communion began, Elias did not move. He did not feel a need for a symbolic gesture. His journey had been a long, painful one, and his redemption had been earned not by faith, but by courage. After the service, as the townspeople slowly made their way out of the church, Finn walked over to Elias. He did not speak. He simply stood beside him, a silent gesture of a friendship that had been broken and mended. The two boys walked out into the afternoon sun. The air was no longer heavy with the sickly scent of the red water. The ground was no longer a sea of mud. The world was slowly healing, just as the community was. The story had begun with a small act of defiance, a small act of rebellion against a world that demanded conformity. It had descended into a horrifying nightmare of fear, of paranoia, of human cruelty. But it had ended with a quiet, powerful truth. The boy who spat in the chalice at First Communion was not a villain, he was a catalyst. He had, by a horrifying coincidence, set off a chain of events that had forced a community to confront its own fears, its own capacity for delusion, and its own vulnerability to human evil. The story was not about a curse, but about the true horror that resides not in the supernatural, but in the dark and often incomprehensible actions of men. And in the end, it was not faith that had saved them, but a simple human need for justice and the quiet, unwavering courage of a boy who had dared to speak the truth.